for the last couple of days, we had quite a few really excellent technical and application talks of deep learning in the medical setting. But one thing that we haven't heard so much is about the clinical perspective, about data collection, data cleaning, labeling, integrating tools into clinical workflows, actually answering appropriate clinical questions, and integrating some of the decisions that are being made by algorithms into clinical workflows. And in my opinion, at least, there's really no better person in the UK to talk about these kind of problems. So Piers Keane, who's our keynote speaker today, is an MD and a fellow of the Royal College of Ophthalmologists. He's also a consultant ophthalmologist at the Moorfields Eye Hospital, which, if you don't know, is the largest worldwide specialist eye care hospital in the world. And he's also a clinical scientist at the Institute of Ophthalmology at UCL. Pierce's research really focuses on applied ophthalmology research and has a particular interest in imaging and new technologies. And in 2016, he started a collaboration with DeepMind, where they've been looking into OCT image analysis and automated diagnosis. And as part of this project, they had a very recent publication in Nature Medicine, where they published a deep learning algorithm that was able to detect 50 different eye conditions with a really high level of accuracy, actually supplanting many of the world experts. So without further ado, I would like to let Piers tell you more about this.
Thank you, George, for the kind introduction, and it's really a great honor to come and speak here, and thanks to Ben and Tom and George for inviting me to speak, and hopefully try and give you a clinical perspective. I don't know if everybody will be able to read the blue writing there, but it's piers.keane1@nhs.net if anybody wants to contact me with any questions about the talk. And as George has said, I'm going to speak about the collaboration between Moorfields Eye Hospital and with DeepMind. And what I'm going to try to convince you, if you didn't know this already, is that ophthalmology is the best medical specialty and will be the first medical specialty to be fundamentally transformed by some of the recent advances in deep learning and medical image analysis and the like. This is my disclosure. I think the most important disclosure to say is that I do act as a paid consultant for DeepMind, so I do have a financial bias. So please do bear that in mind if I get overly enthusiastic and excited over the next hour or so. So before we get into the good stuff, I'd just like to tell you a little bit about what it means to examine the eye. And my whole career, or my life for the past 10 or more years, has been looking at the eye, and not just looking at the front of the eye like you see here, but looking at just one part of the eye. So I like to look through the pupil, through this sort of keyhole into this dark cave, which is the back of the eye, and look at what we call the ocular fundus. And the ocular fundus is everything that you see when you look through that keyhole at the back wall of the inside of the eye. And in particular, that's the retina and the optic nerve. Now, I thought, in view of the fact you wanted a clinical perspective, I thought it'd be interesting to give you a historical perspective to go alongside that. And I guess many of you will recognize what this is, but this is an ophthalmoscope, a direct ophthalmoscope. And this was invented by von Helmholtz in 1851. And actually, until this was invented, it wasn't possible to look through that dark keyhole and look at the back of the eye. And so until people died and you could kind of look at the post-mortem eyes, you couldn't really see what was going on. So if people lost their sight, there was no way really to explain it in a large majority of cases. Now, the reason why I like to begin with this example is because von Helmholtz got the fame for this, but actually it probably should have been Charles Babbage who got the fame for this. Now, of course, as we all know, he got a lot of recognition for his other contributions, but it turns out that von Helmholtz made the first ophthalmoscope in 1851, but Babbage had a prototype ophthalmoscope 4 years prior to that. And I don't know if you guys will know this story, but what he did was he developed his prototype, and he was very excited about it, I'm sure, and he sought out the most eminent eye surgeon in London at the time. And he went to this most senior, most well-respected, most eminent eye surgeon, and he said, look, I think that this could be interesting, this thing that I'm developing. What do you think of it? And the eminent surgeon got it, and he sort of gave it a try, and then he sort of said, this is a load of rubbish. Why are you wasting my time with this? It doesn't work, and even if it did work, what's the point? I don't need it. I don't. And so Babbage, of course, then sort of put this aside, and von Helmholtz went on to develop the ophthalmoscope. Now, interestingly, and this is described in a historical piece in the British Journal of Ophthalmology, it turns out that the most senior, most eminent eye surgeon at the time that Babbage went to was really short-sighted. He was really myopic, and so he wasn't able to use the device at all that had been created. And in some way, maybe even on a subconscious level, his reaction was to trash it and not to see the potential of this device. Now, the reason why I love that little story, and particularly to talk to an audience like this, is because to me it says, choose your clinical collaborators well, okay? Because they make a big difference, and one of the things that I like to think we're good at in more fields and trying to learn more about is how to be good clinical collaborators. Now, that was in the mid-19th century, and so then they went on, others went on to try not just to visualize the back of the eye, but how do we capture the images? And Jackman and Webster were the first people to try to image the back of the eye. And let me present to you the very first ocular fundus, the very first retinal image, at least on record. And so this is the optic nerve, and this is just a big artifact in the image. So it didn't catch on at this stage, and of course, one of the limitations perhaps is how do you illuminate the dark cave in order to be able to capture the image? And the options in the 19th century were somewhat limited, and at the time what they had to do was get a candle and see how long they could basically get a candle as close to the person's eye as possible to try and illuminate things. So that was obviously a significant shortcoming of the clinical applicability of their imaging system. Now, that all changed in the 1950s and the 1960s when you had electronically timed flashes, you had very high quality 35 millimeter film, and you started to have the first clinically meaningful retinal cameras. And it's fair to say that led to a golden era, a 30-year golden era in ophthalmology, where for the first time people could figure out the commonest causes of blindness: macular degeneration, diabetic eye disease, and the like. And that technology has continued to improve. And so now we've moved from film to digital. We've increasingly got cameras that can take good images even if the pupil is not dilated. They can do stereoscopic views. And as many of you will be aware, we can now get clip-on lenses for your smartphones, things like PEEK, the Portable Eye Examination Kit, developed in the UK, that allows you to use your smartphone as a fundus camera. So actually, if you've got one of these devices now with no medical training whatsoever, you can actually, within seconds, get on somebody's fundus and be looking at their optic nerve and looking at part of their brain effectively. Now, and we see images like this. This is the retinal photograph. This is the optic nerve. This is the macula. These are the blood vessels. This is what we're seeing. Now, until about 10 or 15, maybe 20 years ago, this was the state of the art. This was the chest X-ray, if you like, of the ophthalmology world. Now, while this plays an important role still in many settings, this is not the most important imaging modality in ophthalmology anymore. And in fact, the most important imaging modality, more than all other imaging modalities in eyes combined, is something called OCT. And OCT is, for those of you not familiar, is a bit like an ultrasound, except instead of measuring the reflection or the echoes of sound waves, it measures the reflection of light waves. And it can measure time delays and amplitudes of reflected light over short distances because it does it using interferometry. The upshot is that it gives pictures of the human retina like this. This is a picture of my retina, taken probably 7 or 8 years ago. And the great thing about this is the resolution is about 5 micrometers, give or take. So much higher resolution than a CT scan or an MRI scan. But even better, it takes a few seconds to do. So it typically take about 1.5 seconds to acquire the scans, no exposure to ionizing radiation. We can do it on a 5-year-old or we can do it on a 95-year-old without any problems. And chances are, if you ever come to visit me in Moorfields and I'm giving you a tour and I'm like trying to impress you, I might get you to sit down and have an OCT scan done of your own eye and then send it to you afterwards. Now, how do we use it? Well, before I explain, the other thing to highlight is that it's not just 2-dimensional images. We get 3-dimensional scans, and we take these dense raster scans, and that allows us to create these volumetric images of the retina. So this is your macula here, and at the center of the macula, you're going to see a dip, which is your fovea. That's the point of your highest visual acuity. And we use it to diagnose things like diabetic macular edema, where we can see waterlogging or macular edema that is not really apparent with other imaging modalities. And we use it to diagnose things like wet, age-related macular degeneration. And AMD is something that I suspect many family members of people in the audience may be receiving treatment for AMD because, and you may not even know about it, but AMD is the single biggest cause of blindness in the UK, in Europe, in North America, and in many other countries around the world, by far. And in fact, nearly 200 people develop the blinding forms of AMD every single day just in England alone. Now, OCT has revolutionized the way we diagnose and manage these retinal diseases, but of course that comes with some challenges. And this is Moorfields just across London where I'm a consultant, and as I said, we do more OCT scans than the sum of all other imaging combined, ophthalmic imaging combined. And that's sort of good and bad, because in some senses, we're drowning under the number of OCT scans that we do. And we audit the number of OCT scans. And one of the last times that we did this, we were really surprised to see how many OCT scans we do. And bearing in mind that these are high-resolution, 3-dimensional scans, before I tell you, can you even imagine how many we would do per day, per week, etc.? Well, let me tell you, we now do more than 1,000 OCT volume scans per day at Moorfields. So that's a huge amount of data that we as clinicians struggle to be able to make meaningful decisions, clinical decisions about. That number is going up all the time. Now, caveat to that is that's imaging both eyes for each patient, so it's half the number of patients. The other thing is Moorfields has a number of sites around London, so I'm always going to tell you the largest number possible, but nonetheless it's a huge amount of data that we're producing. And in fact, we probably have more than 3 million macular OCT scans now at Moorfields. Now, another problem that we face is this, and this is the high street. And one of the issues is that OCT increasingly is being used in opticians, whether you go to Specsavers or you go to Costco or Vision Express or Boots or an independent optician. And basically, when people go to have their eye check done, they are often offered, do you want to pay a little bit of extra money and have an OCT scan done? Check you for diabetic eye disease, check you for glaucoma and other things. Now, let me be clear, overall that is a really good thing, I think, if it can be used to allow earlier detection of these diseases. However, it does lead to a large amount of false positive referrals to hospital eye services within the NHS. And so the analogy I would use is it's as if imagine if every GP in the country was given an MRI scanner and told that they could do it, and it would take 2 seconds on every person who comes in with a cough or a headache. but they weren't given a lot of training on how to interpret the scans, and they just simply referred every patient into the NHS. Think about the problems that would cause. So, as an example of that, in 2016, and this is even before OCT scans were widely adopted in the high street, at Moorfields, we had 7,000 urgent referrals, new patient referrals, as possible wet AMD. And the Royal College of Ophthalmologists says that if you're referred and on the referral it says possible wet AMD, you must be seen and treated within 2 weeks. Now, the problem we face at Moorfields and around the country and around the world is that of those 7,000 referrals, only 800 of those actually had wet AMD. And the upshot is that a lot of those patients didn't get seen and treated in a timely fashion. So, that has huge implications for irreversible visual loss in those patients. Now, and this is just an example of an announcement from Specsavers in 2017, where they say they were going to roll out OCT across all 740 of their practices in the UK. Now, Specsavers do 9 million eye examinations per year in the UK. So you can imagine what the implications are of that if it increases our false positive referral rates even by 5%. And this is also set against one last little bit of trivia that I'll give you about this, is this. Ophthalmology surpasses orthopedics in annual attendance figures. So in 2017, NHS Digital released this information to say that ophthalmology is the biggest medical specialty in the UK in terms of clinic appointments, outpatient clinic appointments. And it overtook orthopedics in this regard. And so I love this stat because people think that ophthalmology is some sort of niche specialty. Well, actually, nearly 10% of all outpatient appointments on the NHS are for eyes. And that number is growing all the time. So all of this preamble is just to kind of like tell you this is, I think, really fertile territory for advanced medical image analysis, for deep learning, for AI, whatever you want to call it. And so with that being the case, in July 2016, Moorfields announced this collaboration between the NHS Trust and with Google and with DeepMind. Now, in actual fact, we announced it in 2016, but it began with a message that I sent to Mustafa Suleiman in about July 2015. And so actually what happened was, and some of you will have heard this story before, but what happened was I had been reading a profile in Wired magazine about DeepMind. And essentially part of the interview was with Mustafa, and he said, we're interested in applying AI to healthcare, climate change, energy consumption, all of those things. And so that was when the light bulb went off in my mind to say, actually, this is a problem. Deep learning could be applied to OCT scans and to the triaging of OCT scans. And so I tracked down Moose's profile on LinkedIn, and I paid for like 1 month premium subscription to LinkedIn, just so I could send him a message without being connected to him. And the message I sent him was something like, I'm a consultant at Moorfields. We do 1,000 OCT scans per day. We're 2 stops away from you on the tube. We should apply deep learning to these scans. And so my timing was good. And so that led to me meeting him just a few days later and initiating this collaboration. Now, what was interesting was, when I went in to see him, I'll never forget it because for a typical clinician, going into a different world like the tech world is a different experience. We're used to NHS hospitals, maybe university environments, but it's sort of different to find yourself in the headquarters of Google and talking to someone that you've just read about in a magazine. And I remember speaking to him and saying, getting excited as I am prone to, and saying like, we've got all these OCT scans, but we should do this and blah blah blah. And he said, well, how many OCT scans do you have in total? And I went, well, we do 1,000 a day. We've got this, and he said, well, how many in total? And I didn't really have a good answer to that. And he said, what labels do you have? What proportion of those do you have labels for? You know, and I said, well, we've got loads of labels. I'm sure we've got loads of labels. You know, we've got an electronic health record. We can label a large number of these. I'm sure we've loads of labels. He said, well, what are the file formats of these OCT scans? Is this a proprietary file format? Is this something we can have in an open source format? Or actually, do you just have these all like printed out on paper somewhere? And so actually, I didn't really have good answers to that either. And then he said, well, and what are the ethics approvals that are required? What's the information governance that's required? What are the, you know, contractual aspects of sharing this data, you know, between an NHS trust and, you know, an industry partner such as DeepMind? And so, let me tell you, I went away from that meeting like excited, but also like having to try and find out a lot of answers to these questions. And actually, it took me 6 months to a year, at least, to begin to answer those questions. And let me tell you, without wanting to blow my own trumpet too much, in my experience, if you ask clinicians those questions, 9 times out of 10, they'll tell you, I'll be back to you in a week's time with the answers, and then you never hear from them again, because they're not able to get the answers to those questions, because it's such a challenge to find those answers. And so when we have the answers to all those questions, we then go into a situation where we can put a data sharing agreement in place and share these OCT scans. And so it was in 2016 then when we could actually formally announce the collaboration. And we ended up sharing probably a little over 1 million OCT volume scans, and these were all historical, anonymized OCT volume scans, to begin this research collaboration. Now, of course, we recognized from a very early stage that this was potentially a sensitive topic, because this is sharing NHS data with an industry partner. And you know, there's a lot of thought that really needs to go into doing that in an appropriate and thoughtful way. And so one of the things that we did was that there's a section of the Moorfields website which is dedicated to the Moorfields DeepMind collaboration, and still there if you want to check it on your computers. And so we put that up from the start. And there's a video of like myself and my boss, Sir Peng Kaw, talking about the collaboration, explaining why we're doing it, what it is, etc. And then it has questions and answers, such as, do patients have to give their consent for their data to be used? Well, in this case, it was retrospective, anonymized OCT scans. So actually, the patients don't have to give their consent for these anonymized OCT scans to be used. However, if you click on that link, what we do say is, if you want to opt out of this research, here is the email address of our information governance officer. You can contact us to opt out of the research. Now, of course, you can only opt out up to the point where we share anonymized data, because once we've shared an anonymized OCT scan, by definition, we don't have a way to re-identify that scan. So you can't opt out, you can't after the fact. But you can opt out and any future data sharing with industry partners such as DeepMind. And we incorporate local opt-outs, but since 2017, we also incorporate the national opt-outs from NHS Digital as well. And the last time I checked, it's, I think it was 9 or maybe 10 patients or in the last 3 or 4 years who have contacted Moorfields to opt out of the research. Now, none of those patients have actually had an OCT scan done at Moorfields, so somewhat of a moot point. But nonetheless, it's something we take really, really seriously, and we recognize that it's important for us to gain the trust of people by doing things the way we would want them to be done if we were sort of watching, you know, from our homes, from our sofas, etc. Another thing that we did that I think is quite nice is that before we had done any sort of science, we published this article in an open source, peer-reviewed journal, just saying what we were going to do. Now, in fairness to us, or in fairness, it's pretty broad. It's just essentially saying we will apply machine learning to anonymized OCT scans for the diagnosis of these retinal diseases. But we think that's a nice thing to do, and really making every effort to be as transparent as possible about the plans for the collaboration. The other thing that I think is really important is that the research has been really patient-centered from the start. And so this is a patient of mine from Moorfields called Elaine Manna. And Elaine has wet AMD, and she, to me, exemplifies the reason for doing this in one person, the reason that motivated me to contact DeepMind. So Elaine lost her sight completely in her left eye more than 10 years ago from wet AMD, before there was any good treatment for the condition. And in 2012, 2013, she started to develop sight loss in her good eye. And at this point, there's now a good treatment for it. And she goes to her optician. Optician says, I think you're developing it in your good eye. Here's an urgent referral to a hospital eye clinic in the NHS. And she gets an appointment 6 weeks later. Now, imagine a situation where you're losing the sight in your good eye and you're told you need to wait 6 weeks for an appointment. And if that was my mother, I would, realistically, being honest, I'd probably like her to be seen within 6 days. And so this, for me, is the promise of deep learning on OCT scans, to triage these sorts of images so we can get people like Elaine in front of people like me at the earliest possible time. Because all of our evidence shows that if we intervene early, we can actually stop blindness in these patients. So we've had a lot of patient focus groups, patient engagement events, and then when we announced the collaboration, we had brilliant support from the major eye disease charities, such as RNIB, Fight for Sight, the Macular Society, etc. So all of this is, I've taken probably half my time talking about the basis for this, but I can't emphasize enough how important it is to have, to be doing this for real-world clinical applications, and how important it is for all of this work that you put patient and public involvement and engagement at the center of everything that you do. And it's, particularly when we're dealing with issues of large data sets and NHS data sets and the sensitivities around that, you have to be doing the right thing for the right reasons. Now, with all that being the case, it certainly, was seems like a long process where we go through it, but it was so exciting then in August of 2018 when we finally published, I shouldn't say finally, it's not that long a time period, but when we published our article that George mentioned in Nature Medicine. And one of the things I would highlight here is I think there's 34 different co-authors on this paper, and that to me reflects the fact that this was a real research collaboration. So you've got amazing scientists from DeepMind like Olaf Ronneberger, who you'll all know, Jeff Defoe, and others. Who you've got, a lot of clinicians from Moorfields, myself, Adnan Tufail, Kathy Egan, Peng Kaw, and others. And then you've got other scientists from UCL. So a real research collaboration. This was very much not a case of, NHS trust, industry partner, here's the data, come back to us in 3 years' time with a finished product. This was a collaboration that was closely involved all the way through. And I would say a mark of a good clinical collaborator is not just someone who is sitting on some data, not just someone who says AMD is a bad thing, but someone who can actually help sort of steer the research, who can help define new use cases, novel applications, and really begin to sort of at least get some sort of conceptual model of the advances that people like you are making in the latest technical approaches, and just think about how those things could be used in a healthcare setting. Now, it was a great honor then, after all that effort, that it was not just in Nature Medicine, it was on the cover of Nature Medicine. And then, of course, this being AI, you can't escape the hype around it. And so, we got a lot of media attention. And, you can see this: computer diagnosis could save sight of millions, front of the Evening Standard. you can imagine how excited my parents were to see that, and my parents in Ireland, and the amount of like obnoxious sharing by my mother on Facebook of this sort of stuff, which is cool, which is really exciting, but also a little bit awkward, because let me tell you, being blunt, it has not saved the sight of even a single person yet, because the paper we've described is a proof of concept study on retrospective data, and we're still working on the processes to actually robustly clinically validate it and make this something that can be used in clinical practice. So of course, we have to sort of marry our enthusiasm for these new technologies with the sort of like cautious optimism, or maybe even a little bit of skepticism about some of these things also. So don't email me saying, can you come to Moorfields and see the AI in action, which I do commonly get after I give these talks. Now, what did we do? Well, we created a neural network framework where we essentially have two neural networks in series. And we start with the digital OCT scan. And by the way, we use three-dimensional models. So we're not just doing, applying the networks to like individual OCT-B scans, but to three-dimensional models. And we feed it in first to a segmentation model that's been trained with about just under 900 painstakingly manually segmented OCT volumes. That creates this tissue segmentation map, which is fed into a classification network excuse me, fed into a classification network, which is trained with about 15,000 OCT volumes with classification labels. And then the output of that is a referral suggestion and a diagnosis probability. And so because of our original use case that began with that initial message on LinkedIn, our primary outcome was, could it make the right triage decision? Urgent referral, semi-urgent referral, etc. But also then as a secondary sort of thing, can it look at about 10 different morphologic features on the OCT and say whether they're present? And we tried to get pretty much all the big hitters that a retinal specialist, an ophthalmologist like myself, would look at looking at the scans. So the sort of stuff that excites me, possibly a little bit less so for you, but choroidal neovascularization, macular edema, full thickness macular hole, partial thickness macular hole, drusen, epiretinal membrane, geographic atrophy, central serous retinopathy, all of those good things. Now, the reason we chose not to have an end-to-end approach, well, there's a couple of reasons for it, but one of the nice byproducts of that rationale is that we get a lot of segmentation output. And so this is already like 2 orders of magnitude better than anything that's commercially available on the software of the OCT devices. So we can get the intraretinal fluid, subretinal fluid. We get 15 different parameters, and we can get quantitative information. And so if our algorithm did nothing else apart from just giving that information to ophthalmologists when we're monitoring patients, that would be a massive, massive step forward for the field of retinal diseases and ophthalmology. Now, the other thing that I should highlight is that we've trained it on more than 50 different retinal diseases. So we pretty much did all the retinal diseases that would have a macular OCT scan at Moorfields. And so it can make an urgent referral when there's this thing called choroidal neovascularization, but it can sort of make that referral if it's due to AMD, or if it's due to myopia, or if it's due to a range of different diseases. And in fact, the only retinal diseases that we excluded was that if we had certain very rare diseases where there was only a small number of those in Moorfields, we did not share those because we had agreed with our information governance team that to limit the risks of re-identification, if you're the only person at Moorfields with this disease X, then we wouldn't share that data, just to be careful on the information governance side. And here's a picture of the prototype OCT viewer. So we start with the 3D raw data, create this tissue segmentation map, and then for each of the disease features, we create a heat map. So here you can see the OCT scan that's fed in with the segmentation. This, you can't read it, but this says fibrovascular pigment epithelium detachment, where we can see the vascular tissue growing under the retina. This is subretinal fluid around it. It says choroidal neovascularization, 99.5%, and recommends urgent referral. Another thing which I'll say to you is that we use an ensemble approach. So there's multiple networks doing the segmentation, and then multiple networks doing the classification decision. And for me as a clinician, that feels like I'm getting a second opinion from 5 different retinal experts. And in the majority of cases, they'll agree unambiguously, but in those challenging cases, we can kind of get a sense that they're challenging just because of that uncertainty. Here's a video showing this is a patient, a young person with diabetes, poorly controlled, and it doesn't take a retina specialist to see that their retina is completely soggy with fluid, with macular edema. We've got this retinal thickness map, a map of the intraretinal fluid. Again, this is not available in any commercial OCT devices. It says macular edema 98.5%, and in this case, it recommends a semi-urgent referral. Now, here's an example for retina specialists. And what's exciting to me is that this is a case which shows the fact that our algorithm does multi-class classification. So I won't bore you with the stuff that excites me, but suffice to say, the algorithm is thinking that this is choroidal neovascularization, and is also thinking it could be something else called central serous retinopathy, which is a kind of benign condition versus a more serious condition, but ultimately it recommends urgent referral. What's interesting is that this is a patient who has got CSR with secondary CNV formation, and that's something that probably the majority of ophthalmologists would be incorrect when they would make a diagnosis on something like this. Now, let me show you an example of an error, and this is from the supplementary material of our paper. This is a case where the ground truth is normal, but the algorithm is wondering about a partial thickness macular hole, and it recommends an urgent referral, or no, a routine referral. And what you can see is that the quality of the OCT is a little bit poor, and that has led to an erroneous segmentation of the retina. And so this is, I think, helpful for us, this interpretability aspect, because you could imagine a situation where, you know, the world's best AI system is telling you that if someone has got a disease and you need to give them an injection into their eye, and you're looking at it going, looks okay to me, but like maybe I'm stupid, maybe I'm missing something, and what am I going to be sued if I get the wrong answer here, and if I override the system? So we think interpretability is really important, and particularly the flip side is maybe the algorithm will get the right answer for the wrong reasons, and we need to have some awareness of that as clinicians. Now, how did we evaluate the algorithm? We got 1,000 new patients at Moorfields who had a macular OCT scan at first presentation, and we basically, which was completely independent from the training and validation sets, and we ran the algorithm on those 1,000 cases, and basically this is the errors on the referral decision, and it had a 5.5% error on the referral decision. We then got 8 human experts. Experts 1 to 4 are consultant retina specialists at Moorfields, some of whom have more than 20 years of experience. And experts 5 to 8 are optometrists at Moorfields with much more limited experience in looking at these scans. And so how do you think that they did when they looked at those 1,000 cases? Well, not as well as the algorithm. And in fact, the algorithm did better than all 8 human specialists except for the top 2, where it did better, but it wasn't statistically significantly better. However, one thing to say is that this is not fair to the human experts, because in these triage situations, the human experts would never have the OCT alone. They would typically have a retinal photograph, they would have a visual acuity, they would know the age of the patient, they might even also have a line or two of history from the patient. And so it's not fair if we ask them to do something that they don't do in their real clinical practice. So we repeated this, and we gave all of that information to the humans, and in fact, that did make their performance a lot better, and the best human expert got down to 5.5%, which was the same as the algorithm using the OCT alone. And let me tell you, these are people who are like world famous in the field of ophthalmology for diagnosing these things. The type of people that if nobody knew what was going on with you, you would be sent for a second opinion to Moorfields to see one of these people. Now, what did it get wrong? Well, I won't go into the details too much for now, but what the BBC picked up on is AI did not miss a single urgent case. And in fact, you may say, well, why did these world-famous experts have a 5.5% error rate? Well, it turns out that a lot of the things that the best experts had wrong were ambiguous cases or challenging cases where actually maybe it was our ground truth that was wrong, or it was at least arguable. Now, what's interesting, that held for the best human experts, but it also held for the algorithm. And there's so many times where I've had to sort of, like, almost embarrassed, speak to someone like Jeff Defoe and go, actually, remember that ground truth I told you that we spent so long coming up with? Actually, we made a mistake, and the algorithm is probably right, and we were wrong in the first place. And this is, by the way, this is me pretending to examine one of my patients, Elaine, with AMD. Now, what about other OCT systems? Well, we trained it for the most part on TopCon, but we also wanted it to generalize to Heidelberg and Zeiss and other OCT systems. And the way we set it up was that when we trained it on TopCon, when we then immediately fed in a Heidelberg scan to the system, to the original segmentation and classification network, the system doesn't really know what it's looking at. And so actually it's got a 50% error rate. It's just a mess, basically, here. Now, the nice thing about the way we set this up, the way that Olaf and Jeff had framed this, was that we could retrain on a small number of segmentations, about 100 segmentations from a Heidelberg device, keep our original classification network, and now we're down to a 3.4% error rate. And so we think that that's going to be really important so that we don't have to wait for like thousands or hundreds of thousands of new scans to develop, to be acquired anytime we move to a new system. And of course, there are other approaches to solving this problem as well. Now, where do I think that this could help? I think this could really help in things like medical education, aside from the clinical use cases I've already described. And one of the books that I've recently enjoyed a lot is this one from Gary Kasparov. And what's interesting was, after he lost to Deep Blue, the last chapter of this book, he talks about chess players now, young chess players, they typically train using chess computers. And that has had a couple of knock-on effects. Apparently, one is that you have more grandmasters at an earlier age than before, and you have a wider geographical distribution of grandmasters than before. And I think a large part of that is related to being able to use these powerful tools to help in your education. Now, I could easily imagine a tool such as this could help someone be as good at OCT interpretation as I like to think I am in a fraction of the time that I've spent to learn what I've learned. Now, just in my last, because I know I don't have a lot of time left, my last few slides, just to tell you where we're at with this, and then tell you a little bit about some other AI-assisted science projects we're doing. One of the things that I've come to learn is that there's a big difference between a cool demo or a paper in a journal and actually something scalable, deployable. And as a clinician, to be honest, we think that like the algorithm that you publish in your paper, that we're good to go. All the hard work is done at that point. And actually what I've learned in the last year or so is that is far from the truth. And so it was really exciting then that we've been able to work on the technical maturity of the algorithm. And in March of this year at the Crick Institute, we presented a sort of rewritten version of the algorithm that uses a cloud-based API where we were actually able to run the algorithm in a fraction of the time, with a fraction of the computing power, and we did it live on stage at Wired Health. And so that was tremendously exciting thing that we were able to do, and a big step towards something that we can use in clinical practice. Now, I do think that it's really important that we recognize that it's one thing also to have a retrospective proof of concept. It's another thing to get really good clinical validation. And so this is just a paper related to an FDA-approved diabetic retinopathy screening software, the first autonomous system approved by the FDA. And the diagnostic, this is a remarkable achievement, but the diagnostic accuracy they report in a prospective clinical trial was quite a bit less than the results from their retrospective studies. And I think we're going to see a lot of that as we move to proper clinical trials. And another thing that I would highlight as well is the experience from mammography, from decision support tools in the past, where actually diagnostic accuracy doesn't always equal clinical effectiveness. So you could have a really accurate system, and actually you find out like 10 years later that the outcomes in patients are not as good as you might think. And so we think that we can implement this in lots of new pathways in care. This is the new hospital that Moorfields will be building in King's Cross in 2021, on the high street and potentially even in the home. And the last couple of slides, I spent too long talking about patient and public engagement and ophthalmology and why ophthalmology is so important at the start. But just to tell you, briefly mention a couple of things which are one of the nice byproducts of this collaboration between Moorfields and DeepMind and Google is that we now have a lot of the technical infrastructure in place at Moorfields, at least in an embryonic form, to really begin to aggregate and curate our data in a meaningful way for machine learning. And we're beginning to work to transfer that to the cloud, supported by guidance from NHS Digital, saying that cloud services for NHS data is something that is a good thing to explore, subject, of course, to a lot of information security and data protection caveats. And then a last cool thing that I just want to mention to you, because I'm hoping I'd love to come back in a year or two and tell you more about it, is a study that we've done called ALSI, where we've actually linked all our OCT scans to NHS Digital HES data, hospital episode statistic data. So we're in the process of finding out every patient who's had a retinal scan at Moorfields who's gone on to develop Alzheimer's, had a heart attack, had a stroke, etc. And you can only begin to imagine the potential of deep learning and other machine learning approaches to interrogate that data and to go from the eye to the rest of the body. And so an example of that from Google Brain is that you could predict your age to within 3 years from a retinal photograph. And even more bizarrely, for a retina specialist, you can say whether it's a man or a woman from a retinal photograph with very high accuracy using deep learning. And let me tell you, as a retinal specialist who spent 15 years looking obsessively at retinal photographs, I cannot begin to tell whether it's a man or a woman from a retinal photograph. And you can even predict whether the refractive error of the images. So I can tell how powerful your glasses should be to quite an accurate level using deep learning on a retinal photograph alone. So believe me, for ophthalmologists, these are astounding kind of revelations for this field. So, okay, well, I was going to briefly mention the future of healthcare and how this impacts on things. And I'm sure people have seen the site, willrobotstakemyjobs.com, and enter your job. Well, physician or surgeon, I like to think that we're safe, but of course, who knows about these things? But they say we're totally safe. And I would make the point that I don't think that I can't really ever envisage, at least any time in my lifetime, a situation where your smartphone or your smartwatch tells you you're going to go blind, or tells you that you have a malignant tumor and you're going to die, essentially. And I do think that human interaction is going to be always a requirement, no matter how advanced our technologies are. And the high-value skills in the future are going to be related to communication, empathy, creativity, all of these good things. Having said that, one of my colleagues, who's an ophthalmologist from Swansea, said to me, that sounds good, but like, does that just mean you want somebody who can give you a hug and then the AI tells you that like this is the diagnosis? And he said to me, I don't want to be a designated driver for a driverless car. Now, I don't think that that's the case either, because actually what I would say in the long term, I think the field is going to move beyond like image classification tasks. And in ophthalmology, we've got multiple psychophysical tests, multiple imaging modalities. We're going to have multiple omics data. And I would see 5 years from now, 10 years from now, the role of the clinician will be to integrate all of those modalities using deep learning or whatever other techniques are around, and then combine that with all those aspects of empathy and wisdom and communication and the like. So my last slide, before George drags me off, is where are the next steps with this? Well, robust clinical validation is going to be key. So combine our enthusiasm with caution before we unleash things in patients. I think AI-assisted science and getting new insights from images is going to be really exciting. Nice paper in Nature Medicine in the last few days looking at gastroenterology, and just really mind-blowing the insights that we can get if we apply these things to the right problems. And if I haven't convinced you before now, I'll end by saying, ophthalmology will be the first medical specialty to be fundamentally transformed by deep learning, machine learning, artificial intelligence, etc. And if you want to learn more, or if you want to come to more fields and have a chat, that's my email address. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the really fantastic talk. We're going to open the floor for questions. There's a question here at the front.
So thank you very much for the very insightful talk. So I have a couple of questions. I'm here. Yeah. But I think I'll ask one because we don't have much time. So you talked about retrospective data collection.
Yeah.
We all know that deep learning is data-driven. So data can depend on population, on geographic region, on age groups, even time and seasons. So could you perhaps maybe provide some insights on how to continuously integrate the training pipeline to encounter the variability into the model training, the data variability, basically?
So I'm not sure if I necessarily have insights on the technical aspect. I would just comment in regard to OCT scans. A nice aspect of them compared to retinal photographs is there isn't that much difference. There isn't as much difference in different ethnicities and things like that. And a further nice point about Moorfields is that, and being in London, is that we are one of the largest eye hospitals in the world, and we have just such a heterogeneous population. So we have the full spectrum of different ethnicities. We have the full spectrum of disease severities. We've got many different OCT devices acquired by many different technicians and photographers with different levels of skill. So I'm sort of already confident that the data that we have will generalize nicely. Having said that, it's one thing for me to feel on a gut level that it'll work. It's another thing to prove it. And so what we're interested now is, so from my perspective, can we set up clinical studies to say, if you're someone from Ghana with diabetic macular edema who comes to Moorfields and has an OCT scan, will you get the same output as if you go to Accra and you have the same OCT or a similar OCT scan done? And so setting up those clinical studies is really my focus now.
Also at the bottom.
Okay. Thank you very much for the exciting talk, and also thank you for sharing your experience in this kind of collaborative studies and research.
Yeah.
We are in that journey as well at the moment. Okay. But one thing you hinted at towards the end, which is really an urgent issue, I don't think that is really sort of properly addressed, is how this AI system eventually going to be used in the clinical setting. For example, if you are a consultant and you have such a brilliant system in your clinic, how you are going to use this, and what would be the regulators will say?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's an important point. Now, the thing is that we have a very specific use case in mind in the first instance, which is this triaging use case. And in fact, there are pathways that have been established in the NHS where we have rapid access virtual clinics where people come in and have an OCT scan and leave, and a human expert looks at the scans within 24 hours. So we could easily imagine the algorithm going into that setting pretty quickly. Now, of course, there's many applications that you could imagine a retina specialist using it to monitor their patients. or you could imagine non-ophthalmologists using it in some way. But of course, we need to be cautious in that regard because we also need to provide sort of separate evidence for some of those things and consider what regulatory approvals ultimately we have which define the different use cases.
There's another question here at the front.
Thank you for the nice talk. Thinking toward asking the question in a slightly different way towards maximizing clinical impact.
Yeah.
Do you have any suggestions of things that on the data collection or study design to increase the likelihood of having the largest clinical impact and the least amount of decay from your retrospective data to doing prospective work?
So I'm not sure. But I think anything that we can do, suppose in ophthalmology, anything that we can do that can increase the digital maturity of eye hospitals around the UK or potentially around the world, so that it's much quicker and easier to get access to like anonymized OCT data sets from different hospitals, so that we can do much more continuous validation of the algorithm. That seems to be the most important thing. I would say in general, as a non-computer scientist, non-engineer, the thing that I'm starting to feel strongly is that sort of cloud-based applications in healthcare are going to be really important. And so as we see the NHS moving towards more use of the cloud just for clinical care, but also for research applications, I feel that's when we'll really supercharge all of these things.
There's a question in the middle at the back. Yeah.
Hey, thanks for the talk. I was wondering if there was an ablation study done that cuts out the segmentation part of your system, because I feel like you kind of bottleneck your system to agree with what humans think is important for the eventual outcome. And I was wondering if you maybe tried that.
Yeah, so I guess that's a fair point, and I think one of the reviewers raised that when we were publishing the paper, and of course there is a concern that by doing something like this, we could depreciate the performance of the algorithm as opposed to an end-to-end approach. We did repeat some of the studies using an end-to-end approach, and I think that, as far as I remember, the results were already so good using the two neural network approach that we didn't really get any any clinically meaningful bump up from doing it in an end-to-end way.
Hi, thank you very much for a fantastic talk.
Thank you.
I find it interesting you use dark blue letters on a black background as an ophthalmologist, because humans can't read it, but anyway.
So just that's... No, that's not me. That's not me. That's not me. So this is what happens when you convert Apple Keynote into Microsoft PowerPoint for the presentation.
So this was not my question, actually. It was just a joke. But
and then always like, and to be honest, I probably could have fixed it, but just I'm already kind of like at the last minute sending the slides and things like that, so somehow that falls under the radar a little bit. So apologies.
But the talk was fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
But I wanted to ask, actually, whether you have thought about how to bring this technology, let's say, to third world countries like Africa, where maybe people do not have a lot of money to buy a system like this.
Yeah, so I think we have to be realistic as well. I mean, so interestingly, OCT is used a lot in Africa. And so, but it would be, so if you go to Nairobi or you go to Accra or you go to large cities, there will be OCT devices. Where it's not, of course, available is in smaller towns and things like that. And it probably is at least a couple of years away before that realistically is going to happen, because the current devices could cost, the cheapest would probably be 20 or 30 grand, and the more expensive would be 150 grand. But there is a lot of work on more portable or even like handheld OCT devices that people are saying could cost as little as $350. Right. But who knows how long that'll take.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Maybe one last question.
Thank you very much for the interesting talk. I'm interested in the evaluation performance. Yeah. So you showed that the model is outperforming more than 8 experts.
Yeah.
So can you comment on that? So are you saying that the model is able to capture features or signs which is the expert couldn't? And
So-
if this is the case, which kind of features? Have you studied these features which is not visually probably captured by the expert?
So, so the two answers to that are, the first is what I didn't explain just because I'd gone on so long talking about Babbage and von Helmholtz was the ground truth that we took for this was not what the physician would see in a rapid access triage clinic. The ground truth was when they get in front of a retinal specialist and they can have other invasive tests such as fluorescein angiography and like 10 other tests, they receive treatment and they're followed up for like a 6-month period. If they were diagnosed with wet AMD at baseline with all the tests and then 6 months later nobody's changed their mind about it, that was our ground truth diagnosis. So that's the reason why, of course, the experts weren't getting exactly the right, part of the reason they weren't getting the right answer. In answer to your second point, for me, we're only beginning to scratch the surface of the next thing of like, I think there was a paper in Nature recently called Machine Behavior, and this idea of leaving aside how it's got to the conclusions, like can we sort of empirically examine like why it's coming up with these things, how it will we know that it doesn't work in certain circumstances, will it work well in others, and so I'm super interested in those aspects, and I feel like we've got like 5 years of like research plans that we want to carry out in that regard.
Okay, just with that in mind, in the interest of time, let's just thank the speaker once again.
Thank you.